the flowers. Even now, Stevie swore her mother was giving the simple yet effective withering look. But Stevie had been adamant. Peggy had loved flowers, and so she was determined not to skimp. It was the only thing she could do for her aunt except for scattering her ashes. But she didn't want to think about that right now. "Here," her mother thrust a hanky into her hand. "Try to stop snivelling." Stevie took it with a scowl, and Karen slipped her arm around Stevie's shoulders as the service drew to a close, and the final hymn was sung. Lord, but Stevie was going to miss the curmudgeonly old lady dreadfully. What else was she going to do on a Saturday morning? Ever since Peg had been forced to live in the nursing home due to her increasingly poor health and frailty, Stevie had visited on Saturdays. She always took the old lady a treat or two and renewed her library book. She only had one out at a time, because with her eyesight failing, Peg had been forced to rely on others to read to her. And Stevie had always given her a bunch of flowers. At least I don't have her house to worry about, Stevie thought. It had been bad enough having to sort out the few possessions which Peg had taken with her to the nursing home. To be fair to the old woman, when Peg understood she could no longer care for herself, Stevie had offered to move in with her, but Peggy was adamant she didn't want Stevie nursing her. She had sorted out her own affairs with remarkable efficiency. It was one of the things Stevie had loved about Peggy, her independence. If the old woman could do it herself, then she did. "I don't want to be a burden," was her favourite expression, and it used to exasperate Stevie no end, as if Aunt Peg could ever be a burden. It was just a pity the rest of her family hadn't viewed Peg in the same way. Neither her mother nor her sister seemed to have had any time for the old woman. Admittedly, her mother used to invite her round for lunch at Christmas and Easter, but that was about it. Token gestures, nothing more. And since Peggy had moved to the nursing home, her mother had only visited once. And Fern hadn't visited at all as far as Stevie was aware. In fact, her sister seemed to have completely forgotten their great aunt existed. There, it was over. Stevie had been dreading this day ever since the nursing manager had called to say Aunt Peg was slipping away, and if she wanted to say goodbye, she needed to get there quickly. And Stevie had been glad to have been there at the end, holding her aunt's hand and telling her she loved her as the old woman took her last breath. The only regret she had was that she hadn't been able to do more. What with working the unreasonable hours chefs were expected to put in, and the restaurant being on the other side of London, it had been hard to get to see Peg more often than each Saturday. At least Peggy knew how much Stevie loved her, and she took comfort from that. Chapter 2. "How much?" It came out as a strangled yell as Stevie spluttered tea down her chin. She dropped the cup back into its saucer with a loud clatter. "You can't be serious!" Her eyes widened in shock. "Can you?" The rather elderly gentleman staring at her over his equally elderly desk nodded once, his eyes twinkling. Was it because he was having her on, or because he enjoyed imparting good news? She desperately hoped it was the latter. Please let it be true. "You're sure you've got the name right? Peggy Langtry?" Stevie asked. Another nod. "But she didn't have any money, only enough to bury her. She used to keep her funeral funds, as she called them, in a vase on the windowsill." Stevie smiled fondly. "She clearly had more than you thought," the solicitor pointed out dryly. "What about Mum and Fern? Don't tell me she left the same amount to them too." Stevie gulped at the thought. "She must have been loaded." Mr. Gantley shuffled forward in his chair and steepled his hands together, elbows on his desk, a faint whiff of mothballs emanating from his direction. "No," he said solemnly, after a dignified silence. Stevie waited for him to elaborate, but he made no move to speak again. After tapping her fingers on the desk and swinging her crossed legs, she asked, "No, she didn't leave the same amount to Mum and Fern, or no, she wasn't loaded."
"The first option. She left differing amounts to your mother and your sister."